They assumed the old man was oblivious. They believed that night in the dark hallway, it was just me, a 21-year-old girl, being disciplined by my perfect stepmother. But at the stair turn, he stood silent, gripping a small device in his pocket. Years later, when that secret recording echoed through the courtroom, they realized he had not just listened, he had prepared the weapon to dismantle their entire empire of violence and lies. My name is Layla Wheeler, and at 32 years old, I had effectively set fire to the most prestigious family name in Minneapolis. The walk from the heavy brass doors of the Hennepin County Government Center into the courtroom itself was a distance of perhaps 50 feet, yet it felt like walking across a minefield I had laid myself. The air in the hallway was thick, smelling of wet wool coats and floor wax, but the moment I stepped into the gallery, the atmosphere shifted to something electric and predatory. Cameras were strictly regulated inside, but the few sketch artists and the packed rows of reporters created a wall of scrutiny that felt physical, like a blast of heat against my face. I kept my chin parallel to the floor, eyes fixed on the empty counsel table ahead, ignoring the sudden eruption of whispers that greeted my entrance. To the city of Minneapolis, I was the ungrateful daughter, the prodigal failure who had returned from a small life of data analysis to bite the hand that had supposedly fed me. I was the woman suing the great Charles Ellison, a man whose name was plastered on half the luxury apartment complexes in the Twin Cities. I could feel the headlines writing themselves in real time. They called it Ellison versus Wheeler, a civil label for what was actually a blood feud. But the papers got it wrong. They thought this was about money. They thought this was about a cut of the inheritance I had been denied. They had no idea that the money was just the vehicle. The destination was total destruction. I took my seat next to Dana Ruiz, the assistant United States attorney who had risked her own career trajectory to stand beside me. Dana looked impeccable in a charcoal suit, her presence a sharp, steel blade against the velvet smothering of the Ellison defense team. She leaned in close, her voice a low hum that barely rose above the ambient noise of the room. "Are you ready for this?" "Layla?" she asked, her eyes scanning the opposing table. "You need to remember that the game has changed. This is not probate court anymore. This is not a civil dispute over who gets the grand piano or the summer cottage. This is a federal criminal proceeding. We are not just asking for assets, we are asking for prison time." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat tasting of stale coffee and terror. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I knew what today meant. Today was the day I stopped being the victim in the shadows and stepped into the harsh fluorescent light as the executioner. I forced myself to look across the aisle. My father, Charles Ellison, sat at the head of the defense table. He looked exactly as he did on the covers of business magazines and in the brochures for Ellison Ridge communities. He was silver-haired, tanned from winters in Arizona, and radiated an aura of untouchable authority. He did not look at me. He was busy adjusting the cuff of his shirt, a dismissive gesture that I knew by heart. It was the same way he used to brush off my concerns about my mother's disappearing belongings or my own isolation. He had a saying he used to recite like a mantra, usually right after he had allowed his wife to slice my self-esteem into ribbons. "Family is everything. Layla, as long as you know how to stay silent." That was his condition for love. Silence, compliance, being a prop in the background of his success. Today, I was breaking the cardinal rule. Next to him sat the architect of my misery, Lila Ellison. My stepmother sat with a posture so rigid she looked like she had been carved from marble. She was wearing a dress of deep navy blue, high-necked and conservative, the kind of outfit chosen by a team of image consultants to project the image of a pious, suffering matriarch. Her blonde hair was coiffed into a soft, unthreatening style, framing a face that the local charities adored. She was the perfect picture of the grieving widow and the beleaguered mother. But I knew the woman beneath the navy silk. I knew the way her voice could drop an octave when we were alone, how her words could flay the skin off your soul without ever leaving a mark. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded demurely on the table. But I saw it. I saw the tiny, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her mouth. It was a tic she developed when her control was slipping. She had seen Dana Ruiz. She had seen the federal badge. Lila was smart enough to know that you could charm a local judge, but you could not charm a federal indictment. And then there was Owen. My half-brother sat on the far side of Lila, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the mahogany chair. At 28 years old, Owen was supposed to be the heir apparent, the golden child who would take Ellison Ridge into the next century. Instead, he looked like a frightened boy. He was pale, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding looking at his mother, and definitely avoiding looking at me. He was the collateral damage I had tried to save, but in the end, he had chosen his side. Or perhaps, he had never really had a choice. Lila had hollowed him out years ago, filling him with her own ambition until there was no room left for a conscience. Seeing him there, huddled and small despite his expensive suit, made my chest ache with a familiar, dull grief. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The courtroom shuffled to its feet as the Honorable Judge Keller swept into the room. He was a man known for his impatience with theatrics, which was bad news for Lila, whose entire existence was a performance. He took the bench, arranging his robes with swift, sharp movements. "Be seated," Judge Keller commanded. The room settled, the sound of fabric rustling and papers shuffling filling the silence. The judge put on his glasses and looked down at the docket, then over the rim of his spectacles at the packed courtroom. "We are here for the matter of the United States versus Ellison, consolidated with the civil petition regarding the estate of Walter Ellison," he announced. The gravity of his voice seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Let the record show that given the overlapping nature of the evidence, this court will hear arguments regarding the validity of the last will and testament alongside the criminal charges of wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." A gasp rippled through the gallery. The press knew about the will contest. They did not know about the money laundering. They did not know that Dana and I had spent the last 6 months tracing shell companies from Minneapolis to the Cayman Islands, unraveling a scheme that turned the retirement savings of senior citizens into sports cars and political donations for Charles and Lila. The defense attorney for my father stood up. He was a man named Sterling, the most expensive litigator in the Midwest, a shark in a 3-piece suit. He buttoned his jacket and walked to the podium, his movements smooth and practiced. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice a rich baritone that projected confidence. "The defense moves to dismiss all charges. This entire spectacle is the result of a tragic misunderstanding fueled by the vendetta of an estranged daughter." He turned then, pivoting his body so that he was pointing a finger directly at me. I felt 200 pairs of eyes follow his hand. "Ms. Wheeler is a woman with a documented history of psychological instability," Sterling continued, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "She has harbored a grudge against her stepmother for nearly 2 decades. We are looking at a classic case of projection. She is rewriting history to suit her narrative of victimhood. There is no abuse here, Your Honor. There is only a grieving family and a daughter who cannot accept that her grandfather simply chose to leave his legacy to the people who actually cared for him, rather than the one who abandoned him." The accusation hung in the air. Toxic and heavy, psychological instability. It was the same weapon Lila had used against me since I was 14. Layla is just emotional. Layla is imagining things. Layla is broken. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My hands, resting on the table, began to tremble. I clasped them together, digging my nails into my palms until the sharp bite of pain grounded me. I forced myself to breathe. In for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. The room began to blur slightly at the edges. For a split second, I wasn't in the courtroom anymore. I was back in the kitchen of the Northwind Lake House. I could smell the pine cleaner and the stale wine. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could see Lila looming over me, her face twisted into a mask of beautiful cruelty. I could feel the cold tile against my cheek where I had fallen. "You beat me again," I had whispered that night. "You always do." It had been a statement of defeat, an admission that no matter how hard I fought, no matter how well I did in school, no matter how far I ran, she would always find a way to crush me. She had laughed then, a soft, tinkling sound that chilled my blood. She had told me I was nothing. She had told me that when Grandpa Walter died, I would be erased. Sterling was still talking, droning on about family values and the impeccable reputation of Charles Ellison, but his words sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. He thought he was fighting a broken girl. He thought he was fighting the 21-year-old who had wept on the floor of that kitchen. He was wrong. I looked at Lila again. She was watching her lawyer with a look of serene approval, confident that the narrative was holding. She thought the only witness to that night was her, me, and the silent walls of the lake house. She thought my grandfather had been asleep upstairs, an oblivious old man deep in the fog of his declining health. She did not know about the stairwell. She did not know that Walter Ellison, the man she dismissed as a senile burden, had been standing in the shadows of the landing. She did not know that while his heart was breaking as he listened to the woman he welcomed into his family destroy his granddaughter, his mind was sharper than it had ever been. Sterling finished his opening statement and sat down, looking pleased with himself. The courtroom buzzed with the energy of a crowd that thinks the show is over before it has begun. They looked at me with pity or disdain. They saw a woman out of her depth. I turned to Dana. She gave me a small, tight nod. It was time. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but they held me. As I walked toward the witness stand, I didn't look at the press. I didn't look at the judge. I looked straight at the empty space in the air between my father and my stepmother. They believed their own lie. They believed that power was about who could shout the loudest, who could buy the best lawyers, who could control the narrative. They forgot that the most dangerous thing in the world is the truth, especially when it is held in the hands of someone who has nothing left to lose. And they certainly didn't know about the object Grandpa Walter had been holding in his pocket that night. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a small, battered flip phone with a scratched screen, a piece of technology they would have laughed at. But inside that cheap plastic casing was the nuclear code that would vaporize their entire world. I placed my hand on the Bible to be sworn in. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the clerk asked. I looked at Lila. Her smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. Perhaps she saw something in my eyes. Perhaps she realized that the girl she beat down in the kitchen was gone, and something else had taken her place. "I do," I said, and my voice did not shake. The truth was coming, and unlike the lies they had built their castle upon, the truth did not need to shout. It just needed to be heard, one played-back sentence at a time. The first time I met the woman who would systematically dismantle my life, I was 14 years old. It was a humid evening in late August, the kind where the air in Minnesota feels heavy enough to wear like a wet wool coat. My father, Charles, had insisted on a formal dinner at a steakhouse in the suburbs of St. Paul to introduce us. He called it a new beginning. But even then, sitting in the stiff leather booth with my hands folded in my lap, I knew it was actually an ending. My mother had been gone for barely 11 months. Her scent, a mix of lavender and old paper, still lingered in the hallway closets of our home, or at least it did until Lila arrived. My father introduced her as the new light of our family. That was the exact phrase he used, gesturing to her with a wineglass in his hand. His face flushed with a happiness I had not seen since before Mom got sick. Lila smiled at me then. It was a terrifyingly perfect smile, practicing a warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. She was beautiful, undeniable and sharp, like a diamond that could cut glass. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her fingers cool and dry. She told me we were going to be great friends. She told me she was not there to replace anyone. She lied. The replacement began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, efficient erasures. Within 2 months of moving into our house, the physical evidence of my mother's existence began to vanish. It started with the curtains in the living room. Lila said they were too heavy, that they trapped the dust and made the house feel morbid. Then it was the rugs. Then the photographs. I came home from school one Tuesday to find the hallway walls bare. The gallery of photos. Mom holding me at the lake. Mom and Dad at their wedding. Mom laughing with cake frosting on her nose, was gone. In their place were abstract prints, tasteful and devoid of history. When I panicked, hyperventilating in the foyer, Lila appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a tea towel. She looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. She told me that I had to learn how to grow up. She said that clinging to the past was unhealthy, and that looking at those photos every day was holding my father back from his healing. She framed it as a kindness to him, making me the villain for wanting to remember. That was her greatest talent. Taking a knife, dipping it in honey, and convincing you that the sting was for your own good. The violence that defined my relationship with Lila was rarely physical. She did not hit me. She did not throw things. Instead, she specialized in a kind of architectural dismantling of my self-esteem. She would chip away at the foundation of who I was until I felt unsafe in my own skin. It started with the comments disguised as advice. We would be eating dinner, and she would watch me chew. She would wait until I swallowed, then tilt her head slightly and mention that perhaps I should skip the bread roll. Considering my hips were widening faster than my height could compensate for, she would say it softly. So my father, sitting at the head of the table engrossed in his phone, would only hear the gentle tone and not the venom. If I spoke up about a grade I was proud of, Lila would smile and ask if the curriculum had been lowered recently. She would compare me to Owen, her son from a previous marriage who was 4 years younger than me. Owen was the golden child, the boy who could do no wrong. If Owen got a B, it was because the teacher was incompetent. If I got an A, it was because the class was too easy. Lila positioned Owen as the standard I failed to meet, and she positioned me as the chaotic element that threatened the family's carefully curated image. She critiqued the way I laughed, calling it abrasive. She criticized my friends until I stopped inviting them over. She monitored my clothing choices, shaking her head at anything she deemed too desperate for attention. Where was my father during this slow-motion demolition? He was building an empire. Charles Ellison was busy turning Ellison Ridge Communities into the biggest name in luxury real estate in the Midwest. He was physically absent for days at a time, traveling to secure land deals or schmoozing investors. When he was home, he wanted peace. He wanted the fantasy of the happy blended family he saw in the brochures he sold. Whenever I tried to tell him what Lila was doing, whenever I tried to explain that her words were hurting me, he would sigh. It was a heavy, exhausted sound that made me feel like a burden. He would tell me that I was being too sensitive. He would say that Lila only wanted what was best for me, that she was trying to polish me into a young woman of substance. He turned my pain into a character flaw, in his eyes. Lila was the saint who had taken on a motherless teenager. I was the ungrateful brat who refused to be saved. There was only one person who saw the truth. My grandfather, Walter Ellison, lived in the guest cottage on the property before his health began to decline. He was the founder of the company my father now ran, but he had none of my father's desperate need for validation. Grandpa Walter was rough around the edges, a man who liked sawdust and silence. He saw how I shrank when Lila entered a room. He saw how I stopped speaking at dinner. He did not confront her directly. He knew my father would only defend her, but he became my resistance. I remember nights when I would be crying in my room after Lila had casually destroyed my confidence over something as trivial as my haircut. I would hear a soft knock on my door. I would open it to find no one there. Just a plate on the floor with a slice of apple pie and a napkin. Grandpa Walter would leave notes tucked under the plate. They were written in his jagged, sprawling script. For the granddaughter Lila finds unsatisfactory. One read, another time, after Lila had made fun of my debate team speech. The note said, "Loud women change the world. Keep shouting, kid." He was my anchor. He made me feel like I wasn't crazy. But even Grandpa Walter couldn't stop the walls from closing in as I got older. When I was 18 and accepted into the University of Minnesota, I thought I had finally found my escape. I imagined living in a dorm, having a meal plan, and never having to see the disappointed arch of Lila's eyebrow again. Lila had other plans. She sat down with my father and convinced him that allowing me to live on campus would be a mistake. She argued that I was too immature, too prone to emotional outbursts, and that I needed the stability of home. When I fought back, screaming that I wanted a life of my own, she played her trump card. She controlled the finances. Technically, my father made the money, but Lila managed the household and the lifestyle. She convinced Charles that paying for room and board was a waste of resources when the university was only a 30-minute drive away. So, I was forced to commute. But it wasn't just about saving money. It was about maintaining the leash. She required me to be home for dinner every single night. If I wanted to study late at the library, I had to ask for permission. If I wanted to go to a party, the answer was always no. She framed it as setting a good example for Owen. "Owen looks up to you, Layla," she would say, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "If you stay out all night, what kind of message does that send to your brother? Do you want him to think we don't care about family?" She used my tuition as a weapon. Every semester, there was a threat that the check might not be written if my attitude didn't improve. I learned to dance on the edge of her expectations, suppressing my rage just enough to keep my education funded. I worked part-time jobs, but Lila found ways to drain that money too, insisting I contribute to household expenses or pay for my own car insurance on a vehicle legally registered to her. The isolation was suffocating. I watched my peers go to football games and join sororities while I drove back to the silent, pristine prison of the Ellison house. One particular Friday evening stands out in my memory. I was 20 years old. I had been invited to an art gallery opening by a professor who admired my work. I desperately wanted to go. I asked Lila a week in advance. She said she would think about it. When the day came, I dressed up, feeling a rare spark of excitement. I walked into the kitchen to find Lila and Charles drinking coffee. Before I could speak, Lila looked at my dress, a simple black sheath I had bought at a thrift store, and sighed. She told me that she had forgotten to mention that we were hosting the neighbors for drinks that night, and she needed me to help serve. I protested. I told her I had plans. I told her I had asked a week ago. Lila's face crumpled. Tears welled up in her eyes instantly. She looked at my father and said, "I try so hard. Charles, I try to include her. I ask for one small favor, 1 hour of her time to help this family look presentable, and she treats me like a slave driver." My father slammed his mug down on the counter. He looked at me with cold fury. He told me I was selfish. He told me that after everything Lila did for me, paying for my school, keeping a roof over my head, I couldn't even sacrifice one evening. I stayed home. I served hors d'oeuvres to strangers while my friends were at the gallery. I watched Lila charm the neighbors, playing the perfect hostess, while I faded into the background, just another fixture in the room. It was around this time that Grandpa Walter started acting differently. His health was failing, his heart was weak, and he moved slower than before. But his mind was sharp. He began asking me questions that felt dangerous. We were sitting on the back porch one Sunday afternoon, watching the leaves fall. He leaned in close, his voice lowered to a rumble. "Layla," he said, "have you seen anyone touching your trust fund papers?" I shook my head. I knew I had a trust fund from my mother's side and some shares Grandpa had set aside, but I never saw the statements. Lila handled all the mail. "Why?" I asked. "Lila has been asking the lawyers about restructuring," Grandpa said, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the main house. "She talks about tax efficiency. She talks about consolidating assets for safety. But I don't like the way she looks at the paperwork. Layla, like a wolf looking at a lamb chop." He asked if Lila had ever mentioned transferring titles. He asked if I had signed anything I didn't read. At the time, I brushed it off. I told him he was worrying too much. I told him Lila was controlling. Yes, but she wouldn't steal. My father wouldn't let her. That was my naivety talking. I still believed that my father was merely passive, not complicit. I still believed there was a line Lila wouldn't cross. Grandpa didn't look convinced. He just patted my hand and stared at the lake, his jaw set in a hard line. It was during these years that the phrase formed in my mind. It wasn't something I said out loud, but it became the caption to my existence. Every time Lila made a comment about my weight that sent me running to the bathroom to cry, every time she sabotaged a friendship, every time she turned my father against me with a few well-placed tears, I would think, she beats me down again. It was the only way I could explain it to myself. If she had used her fists, I would have had bruises to show the police. I would have had proof. But the wounds Lila inflicted were internal. She was beating the hope out of me. She was beating the identity out of me. She was beating me down into a shape that would fit into the small, dark box she had constructed. And because there was no blood, no one believed me. I was the crazy one. I was the difficult one. I was the girl who didn't know how lucky she was. I didn't know then that the final blow was coming. I didn't know that she was preparing to take the one thing I had left, my future. And I certainly didn't know that Grandpa Walter was watching it all, waiting for the moment when he could finally shield me, even if it cost him everything he had left to give. The bruises on my soul were invisible, but they ached just as bad as broken bones. And as I approached graduation, Lila decided it was time to stop merely hurting me and start erasing me completely. It was the summer I turned 21, just weeks after I'd walked across the stage to accept my degree in business administration. I was naive enough to believe that the piece of paper in my hand was a shield, a proof of competence that would finally compel my family to see me as an adult, rather than a nuisance. I was wrong. The degree was not a shield. It was merely the bell ringing for the next round of the fight. Lila had summoned me to Northwind, our family's estate on the edge of Lake Superior, under the guise of discussing my future role in the company. I drove up there with a stomach full of butterflies and anxiety, rehearsing my pitch about modernizing the marketing division for Ellison Ridge. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to be part of the legacy Grandpa Walter had built. The house was silent when I arrived, the kind of heavy, expensive silence that only money and isolation can buy. My father was not there. It was just Lila, waiting for me in the kitchen. The kitchen at Northwind was a cavernous space of stainless steel and black marble, illuminated by under-cabinet lighting that cast a sterile yellow glow across the countertops. Lila was standing by the island, pouring a glass of Pinot Grigio. She looked impeccable, of course, wearing a cashmere cardigan that probably cost more than my first car. She did not offer me a glass. "Sit down. Layla," she said, gesturing to a bar stool. "We have administrative matters to settle." She slid a laptop toward me. On the screen was a document. It was not a job offer. It was a legal agreement, drafted by the family attorneys but clearly dictated by her. The header read, "Settlement of Trust and Liability Release." I began to read, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. The document was a roadmap to my own erasure. It stipulated that in exchange for a fixed monthly allowance, an amount that was insulting given the family's wealth, I would voluntarily renounce any claim to a voting seat on the board. I would waive my right to audit the family trust, and, most devastatingly, I would formally decline the junior executive position at North Star Harbor, the subsidiary company my grandfather had always promised I would cut my teeth on. I looked up at her, my hands shaking. "I am not signing this," I said. My voice sounded thin in the massive room. "Grandpa promised me North Star. I studied for this. I want to work. Lila, I do not want to be a paid-off liability." Lila took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes studying me over the rim of the glass with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a bacteria sample. "It is not about what you want, Layla," she said softly. "It is about what is best for the brand." She set the glass down. The sharp clink against the marble echoed like a gunshot. "You are a liability," she continued, her voice gaining a hard, serrated edge. "Look at you. You are emotional. You are erratic. You have spent your entire life desperate for validation, crying in corners, making scenes. Ellison Ridge is a billion-dollar enterprise. We need leadership that is lean. We need people who are focused. We do not need drama. We do not need a girl who is still trying to work through her mommy issues in the boardroom. The cruelty was so precise, so practiced, that it took me a moment to find my breath. I am not a liability, I argued. Sliding off the stool to stand up, I graduated with honors. I know the business. You are trying to push me out because you want Owen to have everything. Lila laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Owen was born for this, she said. You were an accident of timing, a remnant of a marriage that failed long before your mother died. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Sign the paper, take the money, and go live your small, messy life somewhere else. I felt a surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar, rising in my chest. For 7 years, I had taken her insults. I had let her shrink me. But I was 21 now. I was an adult. No, I said, louder this time. I am going to wait for Dad. I am going to wait for Grandpa. I will tell them you are trying to blackmail me out of my inheritance. Lila moved then. She moved with a speed that startled me. She came around the island, cutting off my path to the hallway. She was not a tall woman, but in that moment, she seemed to expand, filling the space with pure, radiated malice. She walked toward me, forcing me to step back until my lower back hit the handle of the refrigerator. You will tell them nothing, she hissed, stepping into my personal space. Her perfume, something cloying and floral, filled my nose. You think your father listens to you? He tolerates you. Layla, he tolerates you because he feels guilty, but he finds you exhausting every time you call. I see him flinch. He loves the peace I give him. You are the noise. You are the chaos. She was inches from my face now. I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the sheer hatred burning behind her contact lenses. And your grandfather? She sneered. He is an old man who is losing his grip. He does not know what is good for the company anymore. He pities you. That is all. But pity does not run a corporation. She reached out and poked my chest with a manicured finger. It was a violation, a physical intrusion that made my skin crawl. You are broken, Layla, she said, enunciating every word. You have always been broken. You are weak. You are hysterical. And if you try to fight me, I will destroy you. I will cut you off. You will not get a dime. You will be nothing. I tried to shove past her. I tried to push her arm away so I could escape the suffocating pressure of her presence. Get away from me, I yelled. That was when she snapped. It was not a calculated move like her words. It was a flash of animal rage at being defied. Her hand lashed out. The slap connected with my left cheek with a force that shocked my entire system. It was not just a sting. It was a heavy, solid impact. My head whipped to the right, and the side of my skull collided with the stainless steel edge of the refrigerator door. Thwack! The sound was sickeningly dry, a sharp, hollow crack that resonated through the quiet kitchen. I gasped, clutching the side of my head. The room spun for a second. My vision blurred. I slumped slightly against the cold metal of the fridge, the pain radiating from my temple down to my jaw. Silence slammed back into the room. Lila stood there, her chest heaving slightly, her hand hovering in the air as if she was surprised by her own violence. But there was no regret in her eyes, only a cold, challenging stare. I looked at her. My cheek was burning. My head was throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. I touched my face and felt the heat radiating from the skin. This was not the psychological warfare of the dinner table. This was assault. This was the mask coming off completely. You beat me again, I whispered, the words tumbling out of my mouth before I could check them. You always do. It was a confession of defeat. It was an acknowledgement that whether she used words or her hands, the result was the same. She had cornered me. She had hurt me, and she was going to get away with it because she always did. Lila lowered her hand. She smoothed the front of her cardigan, composing herself instantly. You are hysterical, she said, her voice dropping back to that terrifyingly calm register. You tripped. You are so clumsy. Go upstairs. Layla, we are done here. I stumbled out of the kitchen, tears streaming down my face, humiliation burning hotter than the slap. I ran toward the stairs, desperate to get to the sanctuary of my guest room. But I was not the only witness to that crime. I did not know it then. I would not know it for years. But history has a way of revealing its secrets. While I was cowering against the refrigerator, while the sound of my head hitting the steel was echoing through the house, someone else was listening. Grandpa Walter had been coming down the stairs for a glass of water. He had stopped at the turn of the landing, where the shadows were deep and thick. He stood there, an old man in a flannel robe, frozen in the dark. He had heard everything. He heard the vile things she said about me being a burden. He heard her claim that my father only tolerated me. He heard the slap. He heard the sickening impact of my skull against the metal. And he heard my voice, broken and small, saying, "You beat me again." Later, I would learn that his left hand was gripping the banister so hard that his knuckles had turned the color of bone. He was shaking, his heart breaking in his chest as the reality of his family shattered before his ears. He wanted to rush in. He wanted to storm into that kitchen and tear her apart. But he stopped. His right hand was deep in the pocket of his robe. He had been holding his old flip phone, the one he refused to upgrade because he hated touchscreens. In his shock, in the fumble of his trembling fingers as he navigated the stairs in the dark, he had pressed a button on the side of the device. It was the voice memo button. A tiny red light was blinking in the darkness of his pocket. Unseen by anyone, it was pulsing like a heartbeat. Recording, recording, recording. He stood there, listening to the woman he had welcomed into his home assault his granddaughter. He listened to her cover it up. He listened to her dismiss me. And in that darkness, something in Walter Ellison shifted. The kindly grandfather who left apple pies died on those stairs, and a strategist was reborn. He realized that storming in would achieve nothing. It would be his word against hers. She would spin it. She would say, "I was having a breakdown." She would say he was senile, that he misunderstood what he heard. He needed more. He needed to be smarter. So he stayed in the shadows. He waited until I ran past the landing, sobbing, blindingly unaware of his presence. He waited until Lila started clanging dishes in the sink, washing away the evidence of the evening. When I finally composed myself enough to leave my room an hour later, I went downstairs to find him sitting in the living room. The lights were off, save for the dying embers of the fireplace. Grandpa Walter was sitting in his leather armchair. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. His face was pale, and his eyes were rimmed with red, watery and devastatingly sad. He did not look like the titan of industry. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. I tried to hide the side of my face. I tried to turn away so he wouldn't see the swelling that was starting to bloom on my cheekbone. "Grandpa?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up at me. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask why I was crying. He looked at my cheek, and a profound, agonizing sorrow washed over his features. He motioned for me to come closer. I walked over and sat on the ottoman at his feet. He reached out and took my hand. His skin was paper-thin and cold. "I am sorry, Layla," he whispered. The words were heavy, loaded with a guilt I didn't understand at the time. "It is okay, Grandpa. I lied. Lila and we had a disagreement." He squeezed my hand. The grip was surprisingly strong. "You are not broken," he said fiercely, staring deep into my eyes. "Do not let them tell you that you are broken. You are the strongest one of us all." He reached into his robe pocket and pulled out the flip phone. He held it for a second, looking at it with a strange expression, half fear, half determination. Then he closed his hand around it, protecting it. "One day," he said, his voice cracking, "one day, they will have to listen to you. They will not be able to interrupt you. They will not be able to force you to be silent." I thought he was just giving me a pep talk. I thought he was just being a sweet, senile old man trying to comfort his upset granddaughter. I did not know that he was making a promise. I did not know that he was holding the weapon that would one day cut the throat of the beast that was devouring us. I just leaned my head on his knee and wept, while he stroked my hair, his hand trembling, the secret safe in his pocket, waiting for the moment it would need to scream. That night was the end of my childhood, but it was the beginning of his war. The decline of Walter Ellison did not happen in silence. It happened under the fluorescent hum of a boardroom in downtown Minneapolis, exactly 1 year after the night he had stood in the shadows of the lake house hallway. He was in the middle of arguing against a proposal to cut maintenance budgets for our senior living facilities when his speech slurred. One moment he was the titan of industry pounding his fist on the mahogany table, and the next, he was a fragile old man slumping to the side, his coffee cup shattering on the floor. It was a mild stroke, the doctors said, a warning shot. But in the ruthless ecosystem of my family, a warning shot was indistinguishable from a dinner bell for vultures. I spent every allowable hour at his bedside in the private wing of Abbott Northwestern Hospital. My father, Charles, visited sporadically, always checking his watch, always taking calls in the hallway. Lila came only once, bringing a bouquet of lilies that smelled like a funeral home and spending the entire 15 minutes criticizing the nursing staff. It was during one of the quiet evenings, while the machines beeped their rhythmic count of his remaining time, that Grandpa squeezed my hand. His grip was weak, nothing like the strength that had built a real estate empire. But his eyes were lucid. "I have arranged it," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that required me to lean my ear almost to his lips. "To protect you. You will not be left behind. Layla, the lawyers know." I squeezed back, telling him to rest, telling him not to worry about business. I believed him. I believed in the unshakable integrity of Walter Ellison. I did not realize then that integrity is a currency that devalues rapidly when you are no longer the one signing the checks. Lila wasted no time. While Grandpa was relearning how to hold a spoon, she was orchestrating a masterclass in corporate maneuvering. She sat my father down and painted a picture of terrifying legal vulnerability. She argued that Grandpa's health made him a liability, that if he made a bad decision in his confused state, it could bankrupt the company. She suggested, with the concern of a loving daughter-in-law, that they needed to move assets. She called it protective restructuring. "We need to insulate the core holdings. Charles," I heard her say one evening in the study, "we need to move the titles into the family trust where they are safe from any competency hearings. It is just a temporary measure, just until he gets better." It was the lie my father wanted to hear because it offered him an easy path. He signed the papers, he transferred deeds, he consolidated accounts, and every time a meeting was held to discuss these changes, my name was conveniently left off the invite list. When I asked why I wasn't included, Charles told me I was too emotional about Grandpa's condition to think clearly about strategy. 6 months later, Grandpa Walter passed away in his sleep. The grief hit me like a physical blow, a hollowing out of my chest that made it hard to breathe. But for Lila and Charles, the grief seemed to be a scheduled appointment, something to be performed publicly at the memorial service and then promptly filed away. The reading of the last will and testament took place 2 weeks after the funeral. It was held in the expansive glass-walled conference room of Harrison and Moore, the law firm that had represented Ellison Ridge for 40 years. The room smelled of leather polish and filtered air. From the 35th floor, Minneapolis looked like a toy city, disconnected and silent. I sat at the far end of the table. Charles and Lila sat together near the head, with Owen beside them. Owen looked pale, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. The senior partner, Mr. Harrison, a man with a face like crumpled parchment, presided over the ceremony. He cleared his throat, opened the heavy leather binder, and began to read. The legal jargon washed over me, a drone of herebys and whereases. I was waiting for the moment Grandpa had promised. I was waiting for the protection. Then came the distribution of assets. To my son, Charles Ellison, I bequeath the controlling interest in Ellison Ridge Communities, along with the Northwind estate and the entirety of my investment portfolio. I sat up straighter. Controlling interest? Grandpa had always said the shares would be split to ensure a balance of power. To my grandson, Owen Ellison, I leave the secondary trust fund and the property in St. Paul, to be held in stewardship until his 30th birthday. Mr. Harrison paused. He took a sip of water. He did not look at me. And to my granddaughter, Layla Wheeler, I leave a one-time cash bequest of $25,000. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of my lungs. $25,000. It was enough to buy a used sedan. It was less than what Lila spent on her seasonal wardrobe. It was not an inheritance. It was a tip. It was a dismissal. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at the lawyer. "That is a mistake," I said. My voice was steady, but it felt like it was coming from someone else. Grandpa told me I was part of the company. He promised me a seat on the board. Mr. Harrison looked over his spectacles with a practiced expression of sympathy. "I am afraid this is the most current document we have on file." "Ms. Wheeler," he said. "It was updated and notarized 3 months before Mr. Ellison passed. It supersedes all previous versions." 3 months ago, that would have been after the stroke, after the protective restructuring. I looked at Charles. My father was staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. He knew. He had to know. "Dad?" I asked. He finally looked up, his expression hardening. "It is what he wanted. Layla," he said. "He was worried about you. He thought the pressure of the business was too much for you. He wanted you to live your own life." I turned to Lila. She was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that was completely dry. She stood up and walked over to me. Before I could flinch, she wrapped her arms around me in a suffocating embrace. "Oh, honey," she whispered, loud enough for the lawyers to hear. "I know this is a shock, but really, it is a blessing." She leaned in closer, her lips brushing my ear. Her voice dropped to a frequency that only I could hear, a cold, sharp hiss. "This is the best way for you to be free. Layla, you are not tied to this burden anymore. You should be thanking us." I pulled away from her as if she were radioactive. I needed air. I needed to think. "I will be right back," I mumbled, grabbing my purse and rushing out of the conference room. I locked myself in the women's restroom down the hall. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I scrolled back through months of messages, searching for the thread with Grandpa. I found it. A text from 5 months ago, sent late at night. "Don't worry, kiddo. Your share is protected. I made sure the sharks can't eat it. Love, Jeepa." I stared at the screen. Protected. Sharks. The words glowed in the dim light of the bathroom stall. There was a disconnect here that was not just a change of heart. A man who texts you about protection does not write you out of his will 2 weeks later. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to stop the room from spinning. When I walked back out into the hallway, I saw a young woman standing near the reception desk. She was a legal assistant, perhaps 24 years old, holding a stack of files. She looked at me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a look of recognition, followed by a flash of fear. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, her eyes darting toward the closed door of the conference room. "Ms. Wheeler?" she started, her voice barely a whisper. Before she could finish, the heavy oak door of the senior partner's office opened. Another lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Reynolds, who worked closely with Lila, stepped out. "Sarah," he barked, "Mrs. Ellison needs those files in the conference room, now." The girl flinched. She looked at me one last time, a look of apology, or perhaps warning, and then lowered her head, hurrying past me into the room where my inheritance had just been stolen. The door clicked shut. I walked back in to collect my coat. The meeting was breaking up. Charles was shaking hands with Mr. Harrison. Owen was looking at his phone. Lila was inspecting the signature on a document. I walked up to my father. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the man who used to carry me on his shoulders. But that man was buried under layers of compromise and cowardice. "Take the money, Layla," he said quietly. "Do not cause trouble. You are not equipped to handle things as big as Ellison Ridge. You never were." He said it with such certainty, repeating the script Lila had been writing for me since I was 14. He truly believed it. He believed I was weak. He believed I was lucky to get the scraps. I picked up the envelope containing the check for $25,000. It felt light, insignificant. I looked at him, then at Lila, who was watching me with a predator's satisfaction. "Grandpa did not write this," I said. Lila smiled. It was the smile of someone who held all the cards and knew the game was over. "Go home, Layla," she said. "It is done." I walked out of the building, past the security guards, past the bronze plaque with Grandpa's name on the wall. I stepped out onto the cold Minneapolis street. The wind cut through my coat, but I barely felt it. I felt the envelope in my pocket. They thought this was the end. They thought they had bought my silence for the price of a used Honda. They thought that by cutting off the money, they had cut off my power. But as I stood there, watching the traffic blur by, I realized something. They had made a mistake. If they had left me a reasonable share, if they had given me enough to be comfortable, I might have gone away. I might have accepted that Grandpa had simply changed his mind. But $25,000? That was not a bequest. That was an insult. And more than that, it was sloppy. It was so aggressively unfair that it screamed of interference. Grandpa hadn't gotten the last word today, but as I touched the phone in my pocket, rereading his text in my mind, I knew he hadn't said his last word yet either. I just had to find where he had hidden it. I walked toward the subway, no longer the heiress to a real estate fortune, but something far more dangerous. A woman who knew she had been robbed, and who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The apartment I rented in the warehouse district of Minneapolis was everything Northwind was not. It was small, drafty, and smelled perpetually of roasted coffee beans from the shop downstairs. The exposed brick walls were not an aesthetic choice but a lack of insulation, and the sirens that wailed past my window at 2 a.m. were the soundtrack of a life lived on the ground floor of reality, far removed from the hushed, carpeted silence of the Ellison estate. I had been living here for 4 years. After the reading of the will, I had taken my $25,000 and vanished. I did not use it to buy a car or take a vacation. I used it to pay for certifications. I reinvented myself. The Layla Wheeler who cried in kitchens and begged for her father's approval was dead. In her place was a senior risk analyst for Greenline Analytics, a boutique firm that contracted with insurance companies and federal agencies to find the needles in haystacks of financial data. My job was to look at spreadsheets until my eyes burned, searching for the anomalies. I looked for the pattern breaks. I looked for the transactions that happened at 3 a.m. The shell companies registered to mailboxes in Delaware, the slight variances in expense reports that signaled embezzlement. I learned that fraud is rarely a loud explosion. It is a quiet erosion. It is a decimal point moved 2 spaces to the left. It is a signature that is just a fraction too perfect. This education changed how I looked at the world, and more specifically, how I looked at my own history. For years, I kept my distance from the Ellison clan. I blocked their numbers. I returned their Christmas cards unopened. But I watched them. I watched them the way a pathologist watches a virus under a slide. I set up Google alerts for Ellison Ridge communities, Charles Ellison, and Lila Ellison. Every few months, a notification would pop up on my phone. Ellison Ridge announces new luxury development in Edina. Lila Ellison chairs the Winter Gala for the Arts. I would see photos of them in the Star Tribune. My father looked older, his skin grayer, his eyes hollowed out. Lila looked exactly the same, frozen in time by Botox and malice, clinging to his arm like a decorative parasite. They looked happy. They looked successful. But I knew how to read balance sheets now, and I knew that glossy exteriors often hid rotting foundations. It was a Tuesday in February when the package arrived. The winter in Minneapolis that year was brutal. The snow was piled in dirty gray mounds along the curbs, and the wind chill had been hovering at 20 degrees below zero for a week. I came home late, my boots crunching on the salt-scattered pavement, my mind still tangling with a complex case of wire fraud involving a trucking company in Duluth. I shook the snow off my coat in the lobby and trudged up the stairs. When I reached my door, I stopped. There was a box sitting on my welcome mat. It was not an Amazon package. It was a plain, gray cardboard box, roughly the size of a shoebox. There was no shipping label, no barcode, no stamps. It had not been processed through the postal system. Someone had walked into my building, climbed the 4 flights of stairs, and placed it there by hand. I knelt down to inspect it. On the top, written in black marker, was my name, Lila. The handwriting sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. It was shaky. The letters formed with a tremor that spoke of age or illness, but the slant was unmistakable. It was the jagged, forceful script of a man who had signed steel contracts for 50 years. I unlocked my door, picked up the box, and locked the deadbolt behind me. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that I had not felt since the day I walked out of the law firm. I placed the box on my kitchen table. I turned on the overhead light. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, letting the warmth of the apartment thaw my frozen fingers. I reached for a paring knife and sliced through the tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of old newspaper clippings, was a thick manila envelope. It was sealed with red wax, an old-fashioned affectation that my grandfather used to love. On the front of the envelope, written in that same trembling hand, were words that made my breath catch in my throat. Open only if you are ready to hear the truth. Below that were 2 initials, W.E. Walter Ellison. I pulled a chair out and sat down. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. This package had to have been sitting in a safe or a deposit box for years. Grandpa had been dead for 4 years. Who had held this? Who had delivered it? I broke the wax seal. I pulled out a stack of papers. The first document was not typed. It was handwritten on heavy, cream-colored stationery. At the top, dated 6 months before his stroke, and a full year before the date of the will Lila had produced in court, were the words, "Last Will and Testament of Walter James Ellison." I began to read. I, Walter James Ellison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all former wills and codicils made by me. I skimmed past the standard legal boilerplate, my eyes scanning for the distribution clause. When I found it, the room seemed to tilt. To my son, Charles, I leave the sum of $1 million in the Florida property, with the hope that he finds the peace he could not find in the boardroom. To my grandson, Owen, I leave the education trust, fully funded, so that he may find his own path away from the shadows of this family. To my granddaughter, Layla Wheeler, whom I trust to be the moral compass I often failed to be, I leave the entirety of my controlling shares in Ellison Ridge Communities, the Northwind Estate, and the residue of my estate. This bequest comes with a single condition. She must protect the legacy of this company from those who view human beings merely as assets on a ledger. I read it again and again. He had left it to me, all of it, the empire, the house, the power. This was a holographic will. I knew from my law electives that in Minnesota, a handwritten will is valid if it meets specific criteria. This document was signed, dated, and witnessed by 2 names I did not immediately recognize. Likely staff members or old friends he trusted more than his lawyers. But if this existed, why was the other will, the one that gave everything to Charles and Owen, accepted by the court? I turned the page. Behind the will was a letter. It was written on plain notebook paper, the ink splotchy in places, as if the pen had been pressed down with great difficulty. Layla. If you are reading this, it means my fears were justified. I am writing this because I sense the vultures circling. Lila has been bringing new lawyers to the house. She thinks I do not understand what she is doing when she asks me to sign routine documents while I'm tired. She thinks I am weak. I am not weak. I am just out of time. I have given this package to a friend who promised to deliver it only when the dust has settled, and only if the wrong will was read in court. If you are holding this, it means they changed the game. Do not just run to a lawyer with this paper. They will say I was senile. They will say I was coerced. You need to prove the fraud first. Use your head. Layla, you always saw things others missed. Use your analyst eyes and find the answer. Love, Grandpa. Use your analyst eyes. I wiped a tear from my cheek and stood up. I went to the filing cabinet in the corner of my living room. I am a creature of habit and paranoia. I had kept every document from the probate hearing. I pulled out the file marked Ellison Estates, Wheeler. I spread the certified copy of the probated will, the one Lila had presented, on the table next to the handwritten will I had just received. I went to my desk and grabbed my magnifying glass and a high-intensity portable light I used for examining physical checks. I focused on the signatures. First, I looked at the signature on the handwritten will. Walter J. Ellison. It was messy. The lines varied in thickness. The loop of the J was wide and slightly shaky. The N at the end of Ellison trailed off. It looked like the signature of an 80-year-old man writing with a fountain pen. It looked organic. It had the natural flow of human imperfection. Then, I moved the light to the official will, the one dated 3 months after this one, the one signed after his stroke. Walter J. Ellison. At first glance, it looked identical, too identical. I leaned closer, squinting until my eyes watered. I looked at the W. In a natural signature, the pen moves fluidly, even in a shaky hand. The momentum carries the ink, but here, at the peak of the W, there was a microscopic pool of ink, a hesitation mark. It happens when someone is tracing. When you trace a signature, you have to pause to check your position against the original. You lift the pen or slow down, causing the ink to bleed slightly into the paper. I moved to the J, another microdot of ink at the bottom of the loop. I moved to the E. The crossbar was perfectly straight, unnaturally so for a man who had just suffered a stroke. I sat back, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew this phenomenon. In my line of work, we called it a static simulation. It is when a forger uses a light box or a projection to trace a genuine signature onto a fraudulent document. The geometry is perfect, but the line quality is dead. It lacks the rhythm of life. I grabbed a piece of tracing paper and laid it over the signature on the fraudulent will. I traced it carefully. Then, I dug through the box for more samples. Grandpa had included a few old checks and birthday cards. I found a check from 5 years ago. I laid my tracing over it. It was not a match. I found a contract from 10 years ago. Not a match. I realized what I needed to find. If this was a tracing, there had to be a model, a specific genuine signature that they had copied. I dug to the bottom of the box. There was one last item. It was a glossy brochure for the Ellison Ridge Annual Shareholders Meeting, dated 2 years before he died. On the cover was a letter from the chairman, signed by Walter Ellison. I took my tracing of the fraudulent will's signature and laid it over the signature on the brochure. It lined up perfectly. Every peak, every valley, every loop. It is statistically impossible for a person to sign their name exactly the same way twice. There is always variance. The spacing changes, the size changes, the slant changes. If 2 signatures are mathematically identical, one of them is a forgery. They had used the brochure. Lila, or her lawyer, or someone they hired, had taken this brochure, scanned the signature, and traced it onto the new will. This was not just a family dispute anymore. This was not just a case of undue influence or manipulating an old man. This was forgery. This was uttering a forged instrument. This was federal wire fraud if they had used electronic communications to facilitate it. I looked at the documents spread out on my cheap IKEA table. The magnitude of it hit me. We were talking about an estate worth roughly $40 million. They had stolen it with a pen and a light box. My grandfather hadn't just left me a will. He had given me a crime scene. I stood up and walked to the window. The snow was still falling, blanketing Minneapolis in white, but the cold didn't bother me anymore. I felt a heat rising inside me, a burning clarity that burned away the last remnants of the scared girl I used to be. I was not just Layla Wheeler, the disinherited granddaughter. I was Layla Wheeler, senior risk analyst, and I had just found the anomaly. I picked up my phone. I didn't call my father. I didn't call a civil lawyer. I Googled the number for the United States Attorney's Office in Minneapolis. I looked at the clock. It was 1 a.m. I would have to wait until dawn. I went back to the table and stared at the handwritten note. Use your analyst eyes. I had used them, Grandpa, and what I saw was going to send them to prison. But I knew I needed more than just a signature analysis. I needed to know how they moved the money. I needed to know who helped them. I needed to see the internal communications. And then I remembered the second part of my grandfather's message. Open only if you are ready to hear the truth. There was something else in the envelope, stuck to the bottom, a small, silver USB drive. I had been so focused on the papers I had missed it. I picked it up. It was cold and heavy in my palm. I plugged it into my laptop. A folder popped up. It was labeled simply, Audio. I clicked it open. There was one file, Kitchen 21 MP3. I stared at the file name, Kitchen 21. The year I was 21, the kitchen at Northwind. My hand hovered over the mouse. I knew what this was. I didn't know how he had recorded it, or how he had gotten the file onto a drive, but I knew. This was the night of the slap, the night I told him, she beats me again. I realized then that the forgery was the gun, but this drive was the bullet. I closed the laptop. I didn't need to listen to it tonight. I needed to save it for the audience that mattered. I poured myself a glass of tap water and sat in the dark, watching the snow fall, planning the destruction of the House of Ellison. The investigation had officially begun. The Minneapolis Federal Building was a fortress of concrete and glass that looked designed to crush hope, but to me, it looked like the only place on Earth where the playing field might actually be level. I walked through the metal detectors with my gray cardboard box tucked under my arm, the weight of it pressing against my ribs like a second heart. Getting a meeting with Dana Ruiz had not been easy. She was the Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, a woman with a reputation for shredding white-collar criminals who thought their country club memberships gave them immunity. I had to use a contact from my firm, Greenline Analytics, to get my foot in the door, and even then, I was granted a 20-minute window between a grand jury hearing and a lunch break. Dana did not look up when I entered her office. She was buried behind a wall of accordion folders, typing furiously on a laptop that looked like it had survived a war zone. You have 15 minutes. Ms. Wheeler, she said, her voice a sharp, clipped alto. And if this is about a contested will, you are in the wrong building. Probate court is 3 blocks over. We do not arbitrate family feuds here. I did not sit down. I walked straight to her desk and placed the overlay of the signatures, the fraudulent will and the shareholder brochure, right on top of her keyboard. It is not a family feud, I said. It is a multi-million-dollar wire fraud scheme involving the systematic exploitation of the elderly, forgery of federal documents, and money laundering through interstate shell companies. And the victim isn't just me. It is the United States tax system and about 300 senior citizens living in Ellison Ridge facilities. Dana stopped typing. She looked at the papers. She looked at the lightbox trace I had included. Then she looked up at me, her eyes narrowing behind thick black-rimmed glasses. Sit down, she said. For the next hour, I did not speak as a grieving granddaughter. I spoke as an analyst. I laid out the anatomy of the crime. I showed her the 2 wills. I explained the static simulation of the signature, but then I pivoted to what I had found in the last 48 hours using Greenline's proprietary software. I opened my laptop and pulled up a network graph I had generated. Here is the money flow, I explained, pointing to a cluster of red nodes. Lila Ellison set up 3 consulting firms in Nevada, 2 weeks after my grandfather's stroke. They have generic names: Blue Horizon Solutions, Apex Management, Northwind Capital. I tapped the screen. Ellison Ridge Communities pays these firms roughly $200,000 a month for quote-unquote lifestyle coordination consulting. But I pulled the tax filings. These firms have no employees, no offices, just a PMO box in a strip mall outside of Las Vegas. The money goes in, sits for 3 days, and then is transferred to a private investment account held by a trust where the beneficiary is Owen Ellison. Dana leaned in, her skepticism evaporating, replaced by the predatory focus of a prosecutor smelling blood. "Structuring," she muttered. "They are siphoning operating capital out of the company to bypass inheritance taxes and hide assets." "It gets worse," I said. "I pulled the public complaints for Ellison Ridge from the Better Business Bureau and the State Department of Health. Look at the dates." I slid a spreadsheet across the desk. Starting 6 months before my grandfather died, right when Lila took de facto control, the fees at the assisted living facilities spiked. They added a mandatory wellness check fee, a nutrition optimization fee. They are charging 80-year-old women on fixed incomes $50 every time a nurse hands them an aspirin. And where does that extra revenue go? It flows directly into the consulting firms. They are bleeding the residents dry to pad their own exit strategy. Dana sat back, exhaling a plume of air. She picked up a pen and tapped it rhythmically against the desk. "This is not just probate fraud," she said quietly. "This is a RICO predicate. If they use the mail or the internet to move this money, it is federal wire fraud. Each transfer is a separate count." She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. "You are not just a disgruntled heir, are you?" "I am a risk analyst," I replied, "and I am the only person who knows how the machine works." That afternoon, the dynamic shifted. I was no longer a civilian begging for help. I was an asset. Dana called in 2 FBI forensic accountants, and we spent the next 6 hours turning the Ellison empire inside out on a whiteboard. We found the weak link in the chain, the lawyer. The man who had overseen the fraudulent will was a solo practitioner named Arthur Higgins. I had tracked his license, 3 months after Grandpa Walter died. Higgins had abruptly dissolved his practice, surrendered his license to the Minnesota bar, and moved to a condo in Boca Raton, Florida, a condo that was purchased with cash, 2 days after he closed his firm. "That is a payoff," Dana said, staring at the property deed I had pulled. "Higgins was the mechanic. He did the dirty work, took his cut, and got out of the splash zone." I then pulled up the calendar analysis I had done. I had cross-referenced my father's public schedule, Lila's social media check-ins, and the visitor logs from the hospital, which I had obtained through a friend who worked in administration there. "Look at this," I said, circling a series of dates. The stroke happened on November 4th. On November 5th, Lila is listed as visiting the hospital for 6 hours, but she wasn't in the room. The nurse logs show she was only at the bedside for 10 minutes. So where was she? I pulled up a geotag from a photo Owen had posted on Instagram that day, captioned "Family Business." The location data put him at a steakhouse 3 blocks from the hospital. And here is Arthur Higgins's credit card statement from a data breach dump 3 years ago. I continued. He paid for a $300 lunch at that same steakhouse on November 5th. They were writing the new will while Grandpa was still in the ICU. Dana said, her voice cold. They didn't even wait for the body to get cold. They didn't even wait for him to die. They were carving up the carcass while he was still breathing. Dana stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the gray city. "I am opening a formal investigation," she said. "We are going to subpoena Higgins. We are going to subpoena the bank records for those Nevada shell companies, and I am going to find every senior citizen who was overcharged and put them on a stand." The investigation began to move with the terrifying efficiency of the federal government. Over the next 3 weeks, Dana's team started knocking on doors. They interviewed the former executive assistant of Arthur Higgins, who admitted she had been asked to destroy appointment books before the firm closed. They spoke to a former facility manager at Ellison Ridge who had been fired for refusing to implement the new fee structure. The silence that had protected my family for years was beginning to crack, and inevitably, the noise reached Northwind. I was at my desk at Greenline, analyzing a batch of invoices, when my phone rang. The screen flashed a name I hadn't seen in 4 years. Lila. My stomach dropped. I stared at the phone, my hand hovering over the device. The last time I had spoken to her was the day she told me to take my check and leave. I picked up. Layla. Darling. Her voice purred through the speaker. It was smooth, rich, and terrifyingly normal. It sounded like she was calling to invite me to brunch, not like a woman who was currently the subject of a federal probe. Hello? Lila, I said, keeping my voice flat. I heard you have been busy, she said. A small, tight laugh followed. We had a visit from a very rude agent today. He was asking questions about the consulting firms. Charles is terribly upset. His heart, he does not handle stress well. I said nothing. I pressed the record button on my external hard drive. We think there has been a terrible misunderstanding, Lila continued. We think you are confused. We think you have been given bad information. We want to clear this up, Layla. Just family, no lawyers, no agents, just us. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Come to Northwind tomorrow night. Dinner, 7 o'clock. We can look at the books together. We can find a number that makes everyone happy. We can stop this ugliness before it destroys your father. It was the same pitch as the night I was 21. Come to the house. Let's talk business. Let's make a deal. But I heard the tremor underneath the silk. She was scared. She didn't know how much I knew, but she knew the walls were closing in. She was trying to pull me back into the only arena where she felt she had the advantage, the isolated, private world of the lake house where there were no witnesses. I will be there, I said. Excellent, she replied. Come alone. Layla, we need to be candid. I hung up and immediately called Dana. Absolutely not, Dana said, her voice rising. You are not going there. It is not safe. These people are cornered animals. You are the whistleblower. If you walk into that house, anything could happen. I have to go, I argued. This is the moment. Dana. She wants to offer me a deal. That means she's going to try to bribe me. If I get that on tape, if I get her offering me money to drop a federal investigation, that is witness tampering. That is obstruction of justice. That is the nail in the coffin. Dana was silent for a long moment. I could hear her breathing. You are a civilian. Layla, if you do this, you are doing it at your own risk. I cannot authorize you to go undercover. I am not asking for authorization. I said, I am telling you I am going, but I am not going alone. I made a plan. I wasn't the scared girl anymore. I was an analyst, and I prepared for this dinner like it was a tactical operation. I went to a surveillance shop in St. Paul and bought a high-fidelity digital recorder that looked like a car key fob. I bought a second one that was taped to the inside of my bra. Then I called Mark, a former military police officer who worked security for Green Line. I told him everything. I need a tail. I told him, I need you to park down the road from the Northwind gate. If I am not out by 9 o'clock, or if I send you a panic signal, you drive through the gate and you call the cops. Dana summoned me to her office an hour later. She was furious, but she was also pragmatic. She slid a document across her desk. Sign this, she ordered. What is it? It is a cooperation agreement, she said. It states that you are voluntarily providing evidence to the United States Attorney. It states that you understand that anything you record, anything you say, is now part of a federal chain of custody. You cannot hold anything back. You cannot make a side deal with them. If Lila offers you $10 million and you hesitate, even for a second, you compromise the case. I signed the paper without reading the fine print. I don't want their money, Dana, I said, handing the pen back. I want to burn it down. Dana looked at me, her expression softening slightly. Just remember one thing, Layla. The last time you were in that house alone with her, she hurt you. She thinks she can control you physically. Do not let her get close enough to try again. I touched the scar on my temple, hidden under my hair. I won't, I said. The next evening, as I drove the familiar winding road toward Northwind, seeing the dark water of Lake Superior churn through the trees, I felt a strange calm. I wasn't driving into a trap. I was the trap. I checked the recorder in my pocket. The red light was taped over, but I knew it was rolling. I checked the rearview mirror and saw Mark's black SUV trailing a quarter mile behind me. running dark. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates. They opened slowly, creaking in the winter wind. The house loomed ahead, a massive structure of stone and timber, glowing with warm, deceptive light. I parked the car. I took a deep breath. "You beat me again," I had said to her once. "Not this time. Not this time." I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, ready to face the monsters who had raised me. The drive to Northwind was a journey back into the belly of the beast. The late afternoon sun was bleeding out over Lake Superior, casting long, bruised shadows across the water that looked disturbingly similar to the twilight of that terrible night 11 years ago. The gravel crunched under my tires, a sound that triggered a phantom ache in my left temple, where my head had once met the stainless steel of a refrigerator. But I was not 21 anymore. I was not the girl who had driven up here hoping for approval. I was the woman driving up here to gather the final nails for a coffin. I checked the digital recorder in my pocket one last time. It was recording. I checked the one taped to my chest. It was running. I took a breath that tasted of pine needles and impending violence, and I stepped out of the car. The house loomed against the darkening sky, a massive structure of cedar and stone that pretended to be rustic while costing more than most small towns. The windows were glowing with warm, amber light, a staged tableau of domestic comfort designed to disarm me. Lila opened the door before I could knock. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and silk trousers, an outfit that screamed soft, harmless luxury. She smiled. It was the same smile she used for gala photos, the one that stopped exactly at the gum line. "Layla," she said, her voice a low purr of welcomed relief. "Thank you for coming. Really, it means so much to your father." "Where is he?" I asked, stepping into the foyer. The air inside smelled of beeswax and expensive red wine. "He is on a conference call with the investors in Tokyo." She lied smoothly, closing the heavy door behind me. The lock clicked with a finality that made the hair on my arms stand up. "He will be down shortly. He just wants us to break the ice first. Just the girls. And Owen, of course." I walked into the dining room. The table was set with the good china, the Lenox set with the gold rim that Grandpa Walter used to insist was too fussy for dinner. In the center of the table was a platter of walleye almondine, Grandpa's favorite dish. It was a calculated psychological strike. She was serving me the ghost of the man she had robbed. Owen was sitting at the middle of the table, staring at his reflection in an empty wine glass. He looked terrible. His skin was pasty, and he had lost weight. When I entered, he looked up, and for a second, I saw raw panic in his eyes before he masked it with a sullen, defensive glare. "Hello, Owen," I said, taking the seat opposite him. He muttered a greeting that died halfway across the table. Lila swept in, pouring wine from a decanter. It was a vintage Cabernet, thick and dark. "We are just having a family dinner," she announced, sitting at the head of the table. Grandpa's seat. No lawyers, no agents, just us. "We need to stop this madness. Layla, it is killing your father." She took a sip of wine, her eyes locking onto mine over the crystal rim. "You have made your point," she continued, her voice softening into a tone of disappointed maternal concern. "You are angry. We get it. You feel left out. You feel like Walter didn't value you. And maybe we were too harsh in how we handled the transition. But this investigation, dragging the FBI into our home, it is reckless. Layla, you are destroying the very legacy you claim to care about." I cut into the fish. I wasn't hungry, but I needed something to do with my hands to keep them from shaking. "I am not the one who destroyed the legacy. Lila," I said calmly, "I am the one trying to find out where the assets went." Lila sighed, a long theatrical exhalation. She looked at Owen. "Tell her. Owen, tell her what you saw." Owen swallowed hard. He looked like a puppet whose strings were being pulled too tight. "I saw the will. Layla," he said, his voice monotone. "The real one. Grandpa was clear. He chose Dad. He didn't think you were stable enough. He wanted the company to be safe." It was a rehearsed line, I could hear the comma placement. I could hear the cadence of Lila's coaching in every syllable. "Is that what you think, Owen?" I asked him directly. "Or is that what you were told to say?" Owen flinched. He looked at his mother. Lila tapped a manicured fingernail against the table, a sharp click, click, click that drew his attention back to the script. "What matters is that we want to fix this," Lila interrupted. Reaching under the table, she pulled out a thick manila folder and slid it across the polished wood. It stopped just inches from my plate. "Open it," she commanded softly. I opened the folder. Inside was a legal agreement. It was titled Confidential Settlement and Non-Disclosure Agreement. I flipped to the back page. The number was staggering. $3 million. It was a lump sum payment. $3 million, tax-free, wired to an account of my choosing within 24 hours. And below the number were the conditions. I would withdraw all complaints filed with the Department of Justice. I would sign a statement declaring that my previous accusations were the result of a misunderstanding. I would surrender all copies of any documents I had misappropriated from the estate, and I would never, under any circumstances, speak to the press or law enforcement about the Ellison family again. I looked up at Lila. She was watching me with the intensity of a cobra waiting to strike. "That is a lot of money, Layla," she said. "Think about what you could do with that. You could leave Minneapolis. You could go to Europe. You could start your own firm. You could be free." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This is your inheritance, honey. We are just giving it to you in a different way, a quieter way. This is us taking care of you, even after everything you have done." The room was silent. The only sound was the wind buffeting the large glass windows overlooking the lake and the rhythmic lapping of the water against the dock outside. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. I closed the folder. I placed my hands on top of it. "If the will is genuine," I asked, keeping my voice level, "and if the consulting firms are legitimate, and if Grandpa really wanted me out, then why are you paying me $3 million to shut up?" Lila's smile faltered. The corners of her mouth twitched. "We are paying for peace," she said tightly. "Innocent people do not pay $3 million for peace, Lila," I said. "They pay lawyers to prove they are right. You are paying me because you know I found the signature tracing. You are paying me because you know about the Nevada shell companies." Lila's face hardened. The mask of the benevolent stepmother cracked, revealing the desperate, vicious woman underneath. "We are paying you because you are a pest," she spat out. "We are paying you because your father has a heart condition and he cannot handle seeing his daughter try to send him to prison. Take the money, Layla. Do not be stupid." I pushed the folder back toward her. "I don't want the money," I said. "I want the truth. I want you to admit that you forged his signature." Lila slammed her hand down on the table. The wine glasses jumped. "You ungrateful little brat!" she screamed. Her voice echoed off the high beams of the ceiling. "After everything we gave you, you think you are so smart with your spreadsheets and your little detective games? You have no idea what it took to build this family." She stood up, pacing behind her chair. She was unraveling. The pressure of the last few weeks, the subpoenas, the frozen accounts, it was all bubbling to the surface. "You think Walter was some saint?" she yelled. "He was an obstinate old man who was going to drive this company into the ground with his sentimentality. He was going to give it all to you? To a girl who cries when things get hard? I saved this family." "Lila," Owen warned, half rising from his chair. "Mom, stop." She ignored him. She turned on me, her eyes wild. "You have no proof," she hissed. "You have a few scribbles on a piece of paper. That is not proof. That is conjecture." "I have more than that," I said quietly. "I have the files. Lila, I know about the lawyer. I know about the lunch on November 5th. Lila froze. Her face went pale, then flushed a deep, ugly red. She looked at me with pure hatred. "You think you know everything," she sneered, "but you don't know the half of it. I should have been more thorough. I was too soft." She grabbed her wine glass and downed the contents in one gulp. She slammed the glass back down, shattering the stem. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. "I should have wiped that clean from the start," she muttered, almost to herself, staring at the spreading stain. That night on the stairs, your grandfather kept clutching that stupid phone. He stood there in the dark, clutching it like it was a rosary, thinking he was listening but not understanding a damn thing. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Owen's eyes widened. He looked at his mother with horror. "Mom?" he whispered. "What did you say?" Lila blinked, realizing she had spoken the thought aloud. She looked at Owen, then at me. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard, I thought the microphone taped to my chest would pick up the thud. That night on the stairs, clutching that stupid phone, she knew he was there. I forced my face to remain blank, feigning confusion. "What night?" I asked. "What phone?" Lila's eyes darted around the room. She realized she had slipped. She realized she had just admitted that Walter was present, that he had a device, and that she knew about it. "Nothing," she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual steel. It shook. "I am talking about the night he died. He was confused. He was holding his phone. It doesn't matter." "No," I pressed, leaning forward. "You said the night on the stairs. You said he was listening. Was that the night I was here? The night you hit me?" Lila's face contorted. "I never hit you," she shrieked. "You fell. And he was old. He didn't know what he was seeing. He was just standing there with that ridiculous flip phone, fumbling with the buttons. He didn't record anything. I checked." She stopped. She covered her mouth with her hand. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Owen stared at her. "You checked?" Owen asked, his voice barely audible. "You checked his phone? When?" Lila sank back into her chair. She looked small suddenly, defeated. "I checked it after the funeral," she whispered. "There was nothing on it. There was nothing to delete. It was empty. I threw it in the box with the rest of his junk in the garage." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading now. "It doesn't matter. Layla, there is no recording. He was just an old man standing in the dark. Take the money. Please, just take the money and go." I stood up. My legs felt like jelly, but I locked my knees. I had what I needed. She had admitted knowledge of the night. She had admitted handling the evidence. She had admitted attempting to destroy it. "I am leaving." "Lila," I said. "Layla, wait," she cried out, reaching for the folder. 3 million. 4. We can make it 4. I turned my back on her. I walked out of the dining room, down the long hallway, and opened the heavy front door. "Layla!" she screamed after me. "You are ruining everything!" I stepped out into the cold night air. I walked to my car, got in, and locked the doors. I didn't look back at the house. I drove down the driveway, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. As soon as I cleared the gates and saw the headlights of Mark's SUV behind me, I pulled over to the shoulder. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unzip my pocket. I pulled out the recorder. I stopped the recording. Then, I pulled out my phone and called Dana. "I got it," I said, my voice breaking. "Are you safe?" Dana asked immediately. "I am out. I am safe. Dana." She admitted it. She admitted she knew he was on the stairs. She admitted she checked his phone to delete evidence. There was a pause on the line. "She said she checked the phone?" Dana asked. "Yes. She said she checked it after the funeral and thought it was empty. She said she threw it in a box in the garage." Dana let out a breath. "Layla, listen to me. If she threw it in the garage, that means she didn't destroy the physical device. She just deleted the file. Or she thought she deleted the file." We both went silent as the realization hit us. The package on my doorstep, the USB drive. Grandpa hadn't just relied on the phone. He had backed it up. He had downloaded the file before he died. He had moved it to a secure location. But the phone, the physical phone, might still be there. He was holding his phone. I whispered to the dark car. She said, "This time he was holding his phone." She thought he was just a confused old man fumbling with buttons. She didn't know he was saving my life. "Bring the recording to me," Dana said. "Right now, we are going to get a warrant for that garage." I put the car in gear and drove back toward the city, leaving the lake house behind me in the dark. The war was not over. But for the first time, I knew exactly where the bodies were buried, and I knew exactly what shovel I needed to dig them up. The frantic drive back to the city was a blur of highway lights and adrenaline, but the real work began the moment I stepped into Dana's office the next morning. Lila's admission at the dinner table, that she had found a phone and discarded it, had changed the geography of our investigation. We were no longer looking for a paper trail. We were looking for a physical object that she believed was trash, but which I knew was the black box of our family's destruction. Dana and I spent 6 hours tearing through the asset manifest of Walter Ellison's estate. We were looking for properties that Lila might have overlooked, places where Grandpa might have stashed things before his stroke, or places where junk from the main house might have been moved. Then I saw it. Item number 402 on the probate inventory, listed simply as Storage Workshop, Duluth Parcel. It wasn't a storage unit. It was a small, dilapidated cabin on 3 acres of woodland just outside of Duluth, about 2 hours north of the main estate. Grandpa used to call it his sanctuary. It was where he went to build furniture when the noise of the business became too loud. Lila hated it. She called it the shack and refused to set foot on the property. If she had cleared out his personal effects from the main house, that is exactly where she would have dumped them to get them out of her sight. We drove up there in an unmarked Bureau SUV. The air in Duluth was biting, carrying the scent of the Great Lake and pine resin. When we unlocked the door of the workshop, the smell hit me harder than the cold. It smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and Old Spice. It smelled like him. The space was cluttered. There were half-finished chairs, stacks of lumber, and boxes upon boxes marked office and bedroom in Lila's sharp handwriting. She had treated his life like debris, packing it away to rot. "Start looking for electronics," Dana ordered, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "Look for boxes marked from the garage or the study." We searched for 2 hours. We found old tax returns. We found clothes. We found a collection of fishing lures, but we didn't find the phone. I sat down on a workbench, feeling despair begin to pool in my stomach. I looked around the room, trying to see it through his eyes. Grandpa was a craftsman. He didn't hide things in boxes. He built hiding places. My eyes landed on the far wall. Hanging above the lathe was a beautiful, hand-carved wooden clock. It was a regulator style, made of dark walnut. I remembered him working on it. He had spent months sanding the casing. Something was wrong with it. I walked over to the wall. I took the clock down. It was heavy. I turned it over to look at the back panel. The wood of the casing was aged, dark with oil and time, but the 4 screws holding the back panel in place were bright brass. They were shiny. They had no oxidation. "Grandpa," I whispered. I grabbed a screwdriver from the bench. My hands were shaking, but I forced the tip into the first screw. It turned easily, too easily. It had been opened recently. I removed the panel. There, taped to the inside of the hollow space behind the pendulum, was a Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a silver Motorola Razr flip phone. The battery had swollen slightly, warping the plastic casing, a sign of age and cold storage. Tucked inside the bag with the phone was a folded piece of yellow legal paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but it was firmer than the shaky script on the will. He had written this before the stroke. "If they tell you I lost my mind, Layla, play this. If they tell you I chose them, play this. I am not senile. I am just a man who waited too long to speak." I looked at Dana. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the phone. "Bag it," she said, her voice tight. "That is chain of custody. That is the ball game." We drove back to Minneapolis in silence, the phone sitting in an evidence bag on the dashboard like a holy relic. We took it directly to the FBI Digital Forensics Lab on the 2nd floor of the federal building. The technician, a young man named Chen who spoke in rapid-fire bursts, warned us that the swollen battery was a risk. If we tried to power it up, it might short the board. They had to bypass the power source and hardwire the memory chip to a reader. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of pacing the hallway, drinking terrible vending machine coffee, and praying that the data hadn't corrupted in the freezing cold of the workshop. At 6 p.m, the technician opened the door. "We got it," he said. He led us into a soundproof room. On a large monitor, a file directory was open. There was only one audio file stored on the device's internal memory. Kitchen 21 Wave. The timestamp was July 14th, 11 years ago, the exact date of the slap. I sat in the chair. Dana stood behind me, her hand resting on my shoulder. The investigator, Mark, stood by the door. "Play it," I said. The audio started with a burst of static, then the muffled sound of fabric moving, the sound of the phone being shoved into a pocket. Then, silence, or what sounded like silence. Then, footsteps, the heavy rhythmic creak of the wooden stairs at Northwind. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was back there. "Sit down. Layla." Lila's voice cut through the speakers. It was tinny, but crystal clear. "We have administrative matters to settle." I heard my own voice, young and trembling. "I am not signing this." We listened to the entire conversation. We listened to her dismantling me. We listened to the cruel, surgical precision with which she told me I was a liability, a broken girl who needed to be erased. Then came the escalation, the shuffling of feet, the sudden rise in volume. "You are hysterical. Layla, you are broken." And then, the sound that made me flinch even sitting in the safety of the federal building. Thwack. It was louder on the recording than I remembered. It was a wet, heavy impact, followed instantly by the hollow ring of my head hitting the refrigerator. Dana's grip on my shoulder tightened until it hurt. Then, my voice, choked with tears and shock. "You beat me again. You always do." But the recording didn't end there. This was the part Lila didn't know existed. This was the part she had missed when she checked the phone, or perhaps she had been too panicked to listen to the end. After I ran out of the room, there was the sound of Lila pacing, the clink of a bottle hitting a glass. She was pouring more wine. Then, she spoke. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She was muttering to herself, unaware that the man on the stairs was capturing every syllable. "Stupid girl." Lila's voice hissed. Just wait until the old man kicks the bucket. Once Walter is dead, I will rewrite the whole thing. Charles will sign whatever I put in front of him. Owen gets the trust. And you will be lucky if you get enough to pay for a bus ticket out of town." She laughed. It was a low, ugly sound. 2 more years, she said. "I just have to play the nurse for 2 more years. Then it is all mine." The room in the FBI lab was deadly silent. This was not just abuse. This was premeditation. This was a confession of a conspiracy to commit fraud, recorded years before the crime took place. It proved that the will forgery wasn't an impulsive act of grief. It was the culmination of a decade-long plan. But then came the final sound. The recording shifted. There was the sound of heavy breathing, close to the microphone, the rustle of a robe. Grandpa Walter was whispering. He was speaking directly into the pocket, directly to himself, or perhaps directly to the future. "Did you hear that? Walter?" His voice wheezed, shaking with rage and sorrow. "Did you hear what she is?" There was a pause, a long, shuddering breath. "All right, Walter," he whispered, his voice gaining a sudden steely resolve. "This time you are going to be the witness, not the victim. Keep it safe." Click. The recording ended. I sat there, staring at the waveform on the screen. I felt tears running down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication. For 11 years, I had carried the shame of that night. I thought I had been weak. I thought I had let her hurt me. I thought Grandpa had been a passive observer, an old man who didn't understand the violence in his own home. I was wrong. He hadn't just listened, he had mobilized. Dana walked around the chair and looked at me. Her face was fierce. "This changes everything," Layla, this isn't just a civil suit about a will anymore. We have her on tape admitting to a plan to defraud the estate. We have proof of elder abuse. We have proof of the motive for the forgery. And we have the victim himself testifying from the grave. She turned to the investigator. "Get the warrant," she said. "I want Lila Ellison in custody by tomorrow morning." I reached out and touched the screen, tracing the line of the audio wave. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew he was dying, and he knew she would try to erase me. So he turned himself into a wiretap." I thought about the title of the story I had been telling myself for years. The story of the victim. The story of the girl who got beaten down. That story was over. The new story was right there on the screen. Grandpa Overheard Stepmother beat me again, but this time he was holding his phone. And with that cheap, battered piece of plastic, hidden inside a clock in a freezing workshop, he had done exactly what he promised. He had preserved the true voice of all of us. He had saved the truth for the one moment when it would hurt them the most. I stood up. I wiped my face. "Let's go," I said to Dana. "I am ready to play this for the jury." The moment Dana Ruiz filed the supplemental evidence, including the audio file Kitchen 21 and the forensic report on the signature tracing, the Cold War between me and the Ellison estate turned hot. If I thought finding the truth would make them surrender, I was woefully naive about the survival instincts of cornered animals. They did not wave a white flag. They launched a scorched earth campaign designed to bury me under so much mud that no jury would ever be able to see my face clearly. The counterattack began less than 12 hours after the filing. Sterling, the family's lead attorney, stood on the steps of the federal courthouse and delivered a masterclass in victim blaming. He looked into the cameras, his face a mask of sorrowful indignation, and described me not as a whistleblower, but as a deeply disturbed woman. He called the recording a manipulated fragment taken out of context, and painted a picture of a daughter who had been estranged due to her own mental instability and financial greed. By evening, the local news cycle had picked up the narrative. A Channel 5 reporter stood in front of Ellison Ridge headquarters, talking about the tragic toll of false abuse allegations on prominent families. They used a photo of me from my college graduation, one where I looked tired and unkempt, contrasted with a glossy studio portrait of Lila looking like Mother Teresa in Chanel. The internet, predictably, was worse. My social media accounts, which I had locked down but not deleted, were breached by an army of bots and trolls. The comments were a barrage of hate. Gold digger, ungrateful brat, liar. They dissected my appearance, my job, and my history. It was a digital stoning, orchestrated to break my resolve before I ever stepped foot in the witness box. But while they were fighting a PR war, they were making tactical errors in the financial war. 3 days after the filing, my monitoring software at Greenline triggered a red alert. Ellison Ridge was attempting to liquidate a massive portfolio of commercial properties in St. Paul. They were trying to sell them to a holding company in South Dakota for 30% below market value. It was a fire sale. They were trying to convert real estate into cash and move it out of the jurisdiction of the Minnesota courts. I called Dana immediately. "They are running," I told her. "They are trying to liquidate $50 million in assets by Friday." Dana moved with terrifying speed. She went to the federal judge with an emergency motion for an asset freeze, arguing that the defendants were actively dissipating the marital estate to avoid potential restitution. The judge, having already heard the preview of the audio tape in chambers, granted the order within an hour. The freeze was total. Every bank account, every trust fund, every escrow account associated with Charles, Lila, or Ellison Ridge was locked down. They couldn't buy a gallon of milk without a federal overseer approving the transaction. That was when the phone rang. It was 11 o'clock at night. I was sitting on my floor, surrounded by case files, when my screen lit up. "Dad." I stared at the name. He hadn't called me in 4 years, not on my birthday, not on Christmas. I picked it up. "Hello, Charles," I said. I couldn't bring myself to call him Dad. "Layla." His voice was cracked, sounding older than his years. It was thin and trembling. You have to stop this. Please. You are killing us." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill it. "Your mother, Lila, is in a state," he continued, his voice rising in panic. "She can't access her accounts. The vendors are calling. The construction crews are walking off the job because the checks bounced. You are destroying the company your grandfather built. Is that what you want? To burn it all down?" He didn't ask about me. He didn't ask if the tape was true. He didn't ask if his wife had really beaten his daughter or forged his father's signature. He only cared about the machinery of his comfort. "I am not destroying it. Charles," I said coldly, "I am saving what is left of it from the thieves you led into your house." He let out a sob. It was a pathetic, wet sound. "What do you want, Layla? Tell me. Is it money? Is $3 million not enough? I can get 5. I can borrow against the life insurance. Just tell me the number that makes you go away." The tragedy of it hit me then. He truly didn't understand. He had lived in a world of transactions for so long that he thought dignity was something you could buy on Amazon. "It is not about the money," I said, my voice shaking with a sudden surge of grief for the father I wished I had. "I want you to admit it. I want you to say that you knew. I want you to say that you let her abuse me because it was easier than fighting her." There was a long silence on the other end. "She loves you, Layla," he whispered weakly. "She was strict. But she—" I hung up. There was no point. He was not a villain. He was something worse. He was a coward who had mortgaged his soul for a quiet life, and now that the bill was due, he was bankrupt. But while Charles was breaking down, Owen was waking up. My half-brother was the weak link, and Dana knew it. The FBI had begun summoning the signatories of the Nevada shell companies. Owen's name was on every single document. He was listed as the managing partner of the consulting firms that were draining the nursing homes. Technically, on paper, he was the mastermind of a federal racketeering scheme. Dana had brought him in for a proffer session, a casual interview where he could sniff out the danger without being under arrest. She showed him the sentencing guidelines for wire fraud and elder abuse of this magnitude. He was looking at 15 years in federal prison. Lila, meanwhile, had been careful to keep her name off the direct operating papers, using Owen as her human shield. 2 days after my father's call, I received a text from an unknown number. "Caribou Coffee on Hennepin. Back booth. Come alone, please." I knew who it was. I went. I didn't tell Dana, though I knew I should have. I needed to look him in the eye. Owen was sitting in the back corner of the coffee shop, wearing a hoodie pulled low over his face. He looked like a ghost. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't lift his cup. When I sat down, he didn't look up. "She is going to let me take the fall, isn't she?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that had finally settled in his gut. "Yes," I said. "She set it up that way. Owen, you signed the checks. You are the director. She is just the grieving widow in the background." He looked up then. His eyes were red-rimmed and terrified. "I didn't know about the fees. Layla, I swear. She just brought me papers. She said it was tax optimization. She said Dad wanted me to learn the business. I just signed where she put the sticky notes." I believed him. Owen wasn't malicious. He was lazy and entitled. A product of Lila's spoiling. He was a useful idiot. "Ignorance is not a defense in federal court," I told him. "But cooperation is." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled sheaf of papers. "I found these in her home office," he whispered, sliding them across the table. She thought she shredded them, but the shredder bin was full, so she just tore them in half and threw them in the recycling. I pieced the papers together. They were printouts of emails between Grandpa Walter and Arthur Higgins, the crooked lawyer. They were dated 2 weeks before the stroke. In the original email, Grandpa had written, "I want a clause inserted that specifically protects Layla's position in North Star. She is to have veto power on board decisions." On the printout, Lila's handwriting was scrawled in red ink in the margins. "Delete this. Too messy. Change to cash payout. Make sure Charles does not see this version." This was the smoking gun. It wasn't just forgery. It was a documented conspiracy to alter the intent of the testator before the forgery even happened. It proved that Lila had been intercepting Grandpa's legal communications and editing them before presenting them to my father. Owen looked at me, tears streaming down his face. I remember that day. He said, "She made me drive the envelope to the lawyer. She told me it was Grandpa's birthday card list. I delivered the order to cut you out, Layla, and I didn't even know it." I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm. It was the first time I had touched my brother with affection in 10 years. "You can fix it, Owen, but you have to pick a side. You can be her son, or you can be a witness. You cannot be both." The next morning, Owen walked into the U.S. Attorney's office with his own lawyer. He laid the emails on Dana's desk. He gave a recorded statement detailing the secret meetings, the pressure Lila put on him to sign the shell company documents, and her explicit instructions to hide the financial reports from Charles. In exchange, Dana offered him a deal: immunity from prosecution for the fraud charges, provided he testified against his mother and surrendered all assets gained from the scheme. He signed it. The golden boy had finally broken out of the cage, but he had to burn the house down to get out. Lila found out about the deal 48 hours later. The news broke while she was at the Winter Solstice Gala, the biggest charity event of the Minneapolis social calendar. She had decided to attend despite the scandal, a desperate attempt to project normalcy and power. She was wearing a silver gown, holding court near the champagne fountain, pretending that her world wasn't disintegrating. Someone, maybe a reporter, maybe a rival socialite, showed her the headline on their phone: "Ellison heir turns state's witness. Son to testify against mother in fraud probe." The video that went viral later that night was shot by a waiter. In the clip, Lila stares at the phone. Her face goes rigid. The perfectly constructed mask of the benevolent matriarch slips, revealing the snarling creature underneath. She screams. It isn't a word. It is a primal sound of rage. She throws her champagne glass against the wall, shattering a mirror. "He is a traitor!" she shrieks, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "I gave him everything. I built this for him. He is a weak, spineless coward just like his father." People start backing away. Security moves in. Lila turns to the crowd, her eyes wild, her hair coming loose from its pins. "You are all vultures," she yells, pointing a shaking finger at the donors she had charmed for years. "You think you are better than me? I did what I had to do. I did it for the family." It was a public confession of moral bankruptcy. In 2 minutes of shaky iPhone footage, the image of Lila Ellison, the saint of St. Paul, was obliterated. She wasn't the victim. She was a woman who would eat her own young to survive. I watched the video from my apartment, eating takeout noodles. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction. The assets were frozen. My father was broken. Owen had defected, and Lila had exposed herself to the world. They had no money. They had no allies. They had no reputation. All that was left was the courtroom. It was the only place left for them to stand, and it was the place where I was waiting for them. I closed my laptop. The investigation was over. The trial was about to begin, and thanks to Grandpa's phone and Owen's fear, I wasn't walking in as the plaintiff anymore. I was walking in as the executioner. The final showdown in the federal courthouse did not feel like a battle. It felt like a surgery. We were there to cut the cancer out of the Ellison family, and the air in the courtroom was sterile, cold, and sharp with the scent of antiseptic and fear. Judge Keller sat on the bench, his face a mask of stone. The gallery was packed. Reporters who had spent the last week dragging my name through the mud were now leaning forward, hungry for the finale. My father sat at the defense table, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 days. Beside him, Lila was perfectly still, her spine rigid, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. She was wearing white. It was a calculated choice, a visual plea of innocence, but against the gray walls of the courtroom, she just looked like a ghost haunting her own funeral. The defense opened with a character assassination that was brutal in its efficiency. Sterling, their lead attorney, did not attack the evidence directly. He attacked the messenger. He paced in front of the jury box, holding a file that I recognized with a sick lurch of my stomach. It was my medical history. Specifically, the therapy notes from the year after my mother died. Ms. Wheeler has a documented history of dissociation, Sterling said, his voice smooth and sympathetic. He waved the papers gently. At 14 years old, she reported hearing voices. She reported believing that inanimate objects were sending her messages. She was a grieving child who created detailed fantasy worlds to escape her pain. He stopped and looked directly at me. We are not saying Ms. Wheeler is lying, he continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. We are saying that she cannot distinguish between what is real and what she has imagined to cope with her trauma. She believes she was abused. She believes there is a conspiracy, just like she believed her mother was speaking to her through the television when she was 14. This is not a criminal case. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tragedy of mental illness. I felt the eyes of the jury drift toward me. They saw the instability Sterling was painting. They saw a broken girl, not a whistleblower. I looked at Dana Ruiz. She didn't flinch. She just wrote a single word on her legal pad. Wait. When it was our turn, Dana didn't make a speech. She simply stood up and called her first witness. The United States calls Owen Ellison. A ripple of shock went through the room. Lila's head snapped toward the back of the courtroom. She watched as her son, the boy she had molded into a prince, walked through the double doors. Owen looked terrified. He was wearing a suit that seemed too big for him, and he kept his eyes fixed on the floor as he walked past his mother to the witness stand. He took the oath. His voice cracked on the words, "So help me God." Dana approached the stand gently. She treated him not like a co-conspirator, but like a bomb disposal expert handling a live wire. Mr. Ellison, she began, can you explain to the court your role in the Nevada consulting firms known as Blue Horizon and Apex Management? Owen gripped the railing of the witness box. I was the managing director, he said quietly. And what did these firms do? Dana asked. What services did they provide to Ellison Ridge communities in exchange for the $200,000 a month they billed? Owen swallowed. He looked at his father. Charles was staring at him with a look of dawning horror. Nothing, Owen whispered. They didn't do anything. They were shell companies. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Keller banged his gavel once, a sharp crack that silenced the room. Dana continued, her voice hardening. Who instructed you to set up these companies, Owen? My mother, he said, Lila Ellison. And the will? Dana asked, holding up the document that had disinherited me. Did you believe that will was genuine? No, Owen said, tears starting to track down his face. I knew it wasn't. I drove the drafts to the lawyer myself. I saw her editing Grandpa's emails. She deleted the parts about Layla. She told me that Grandpa was confused and that we had to fix it for him. Lila was shaking. Her hands were clenched into fists on the table. She looked like she wanted to leap across the barricade and strangle him. But Dana wasn't done. Your Honor, she said, turning to the judge, the government would now like to introduce Exhibit 4A, an audio file recovered from a digital device found concealed in the personal property of the deceased, Walter Ellison. This was it, the nuclear option. The clerk dimmed the lights. A large screen descended from the ceiling, displaying a simple audio waveform. The room went deadly silent. You could hear the hum of the ventilation system. You could hear the scratch of a reporter's pen. Dana pressed play. Sit down, Layla. Lila's voice filled the room. It wasn't the soft, polished voice she used in public. It was the cold, imperious voice of the kitchen. The jury listened as she berated me. They listened as she called me a liability. They listened to the cruelty that dripped from every syllable. Then came the sound. Thwack! It echoed off the mahogany walls. It was unmistakable. The wet slap of flesh against flesh, followed by the hollow, sickening thud of my skull hitting the refrigerator. I saw the jurors flinch. One woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hand. You beat me again. My voice whimpered from the speakers. You always do. Lila was staring at the table, her face pale as ash. But the recording played on. It reached the part she had never heard, the part she didn't know existed. Stupid girl. The recording hissed. Just wait until the old man kicks the bucket. Once Walter is dead, I will rewrite the whole thing. The gasps in the room were audible now. This was conspiracy. This was premeditated fraud. It was a confession captured in real time, years before the crime was committed. And then, the final voice, the ghost in the machine. Did you hear that, Walter? My grandfather's voice was rasping, struggling for breath, but filled with a terrifying clarity. All right, Walter. This time you are going to be the witness, not the victim. Keep it safe. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a narrative shattering. Sterling's story about a crazy, hallucinating daughter had just been vaporized by the voice of the dead man himself. Lila stood up. It wasn't a slow rise. She shot out of her chair like she had been electrocuted. Her composure, honed over decades of social climbing and manipulation, snapped. "It is a lie!" she screamed, her voice shrill and unrecognizable. "That is taken out of context. It was just one slap." The room froze. Lila realized too late what she had said. She stood there, chest heaving, her eyes wild. "It was just one slap for an insolent adult who was disrespecting me," she yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. She was hysterical. She needed to be brought back to reality. Sterling put his head in his hands. It was over. She had just confessed to the assault in open court. She had validated the tape. Judge Keller looked at her over the rim of his glasses. His expression was one of profound disgust. "Sit down, Mrs. Ellison," he commanded, "or I will have you removed." Lila sank back into her chair, realizing that the white dress she wore was no longer a symbol of innocence, but a shroud. But Dana had one last piece of business. She turned to the defense table. "The government calls Charles Ellison." My father took the stand. He walked slowly, like an old man navigating ice. He sat down and looked at me. His eyes were wet. "Mr. Ellison," Dana asked, her voice softer now. "Did you know?" Charles looked at his hands. "Did you know about the handwritten will?" Dana pressed. "The one your father wrote before the stroke?" Charles closed his eyes. He took a long, shuddering breath. "I saw a draft," he whispered. "Lila told me. She told me the lawyer said it was invalid. She said Dad wasn't thinking clearly. She said we had to protect the company." "So you never verified it?" Dana asked. "You never asked your father?" He shook his head. "I didn't want to know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. It was easier to believe her. It was easier to believe that he chose me. He looked up at me then, tears spilling over his cheeks. "I am sorry, Layla," he said. "I just wanted peace." "You bought your peace with your daughter's inheritance," Dana said coldly. "No further questions." The closing arguments were short. There was nothing left to say. The evidence wasn't just a pile of documents anymore. It was a living, breathing thing that had consumed the defense whole. Judge Keller didn't retire to chambers for long. When he returned, the atmosphere in the room was electric. He adjusted his robes and looked down at the defendants. "In 30 years on the bench," he began, his voice resonating with judicial fury, "I have rarely seen a case of such calculated malice. This was not just a theft of assets. This was a theft of dignity. This was a systematic campaign to destroy a young woman and exploit a vulnerable old man." He looked at Lila. "Lila Ellison, the evidence of your fraud, elder abuse, and witness tampering is overwhelming. This court finds that the probated will is a product of forgery and coercion. It is hereby declared void ab initio." He picked up a document. The court recognizes the handwritten will of Walter James Ellison, dated June 12th, as the true and valid last testament of the deceased. He turned to me. "Ms. Wheeler, under the terms of this will, You are the sole beneficiary of the controlling shares of Ellison Ridge Communities and the Northwind Estate. The assets previously frozen are released to your control immediately." He paused, looking at the final clause of the will. "There is, however, a condition attached to this bequest." He noted, "Mr. Ellison stipulated that you must use a portion of these assets to protect others." I stood up. "I know, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. "I intend to establish the Walter Ellison Legal Defense Fund for victims of financial abuse and coercive control. It starts today." "So ordered," Judge Keller said. Then he turned to the marshals. "Mr. and Mrs. Ellison are remanded into custody pending sentencing. Bail is denied due to flight risk." The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Two marshals moved toward the defense table. Lila stood up. She held her head high for a moment, trying to summon the ghost of her former arrogance, but when the marshal pulled her hands behind her back, she crumbled. I watched as the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. It was a mechanical sound, final and cold. She looked at me one last time. There was no hatred left in her eyes, only a vast, empty shock. She couldn't believe that the girl she had beaten in the kitchen had just put her in chains. Charles was led away separately. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, a man crushed by the weight of his own apathy. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I didn't feel the urge to cheer. I felt a profound, heavy relief, like a physical weight had been lifted from my chest. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in 11 years, the air didn't taste like fear. I looked at the empty spot on the witness stand where the screen had been. Grandpa overheard. I thought, he recorded. He trusted me to finish what he started. I walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was lined with cameras, the flashbulbs exploding like fireworks. Reporters shouted questions, asking how it felt to own the city, asking about the money, asking about my family. I ignored them. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and stepped out onto the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The Minneapolis air was biting cold, 20 degrees below zero, but it felt clean. The sky was a brilliant, hard blue. I looked up at the skyscrapers, at the city my grandfather had helped build. I put my hand in my pocket and touched the small plastic shape of the digital recorder I still carried. That night, I whispered to the wind, "You held the phone, Grandpa. You held the truth in the dark when no one else could see." I took my hand out of my pocket and looked at my own palm. It was empty, but it felt powerful. "Today," I said, "I hold my own voice." I walked down the steps, past the cameras, past the noise, and into the quiet hum of the city. The circle was closed, the debt was paid, and the story, our story, was finally, truly, mine. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment down below where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories, like the video, and hit the like button to help this story reach more people.